to this month's edition of our Riley Blake Table Topper of the Month project. This month we are working on pumpkins squared. Now when looking at this project, we have a giant pieced patch in the center surrounded by pieced pumpkins and our 9 patches in the corner. The pumpkins that are around the edges are created with the sew and flip technique that we have been doing multiple times throughout this year. So we have a small square on the corner that is, we draw a line diagonally from corner to corner, stitch on the line, trim a 1/4 inch away, and the suggestion is to press away. Now, these are some very small pieces that we are working with in this month for making the stems and the pumpkins. So I highly suggest that you, a little tip on using smaller pieces or piecing with smaller pieces is 1, to use some starch. So we'll talk about that, as well as I'm going to show you a technique on how to create this patched center without having to sew and pin a bunch of 2.5 inch squares. I'm going to give you a very quick and easy way to be able to create this using a fantastic product. So we will talk on that. So if you look at your instructions, cutting information is all in your instructions. All your color coding keys are there as well. One thing that we did find or make note of, that with this particular print here in your instructions, you need to be very careful with this particular piece, because if you do make a mistake, there is not a lot of extra fabric in your kit to fix a miscut in this world. So be very conscious of cutting that raisin, they call it raisin gingham. Okay, that's there. The other thing that we want to make note of is if and when you are cutting your background for this project, you know, you have a bunch of strips that you're going to cut. If you cut your strips and then slowly cut things out of it and then use the extra that's in the strip that you didn't use, you can cut down. So if you are conscious of how you're cutting, you can have some extra of the background left, and you may not need, we didn't need the 1.25 inch strip from the cutting that was required, because we were able to get all of those other pieces out of the previously cut strip extras. Just a few notes. So let's talk about this center section. This is made with 2.5 inch squares that you are cutting out of all of your fabrics that they suggest. I am using a product called Easy Piecing Grid. Now, if you've been in the quilt world a while, you may kind of see this as watercolor grid. This is just the same kind of concept. It is from a company called 10 Sisters that we carry here in the store. If you go to our online store, you can search Easy Piecing Grid and it will all pop up. We are using the Easy Piecing Grid that is a 2 inch square for today, because we're cutting 2.5. This square right here is 2.5. That's printed in onto the grid, and it will finish at 2. I am using the border grid. The border grid is 4 squares wide, and it comes 36 squares long. And that's perfect because we need some sections that are 36 inches, and we need them to be 3 inches tall. Now we're going to piece this grid together because we need this to be 12 squares. okay, by 36 squares. Now you can, let me grab the picture here. If you wanted, you could complete this technique like they do in the instructions, where they piece together 9 patches and then sew the 9 patches together. If you're going to try out the grid method, you could piece 4 units that are 3 inches tall and 12 inches long, or we can create the grid the exact size that we need. Now, to create the grid, we're going to take and apply the 2.5-inch squares to the grid inside of each of the printed little units. You can see there's a little square unit. We're just going to take the square and lay it in there. It doesn't have to be super exact. We just want it to be inside the dotted lines that appear there, and we just want to make sure that it's not more than 1/4 inch away, because we are going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. Now, this border grid panel has been cut down to the exact size of the center. So it is 3 squares across, or 3 squares tall by 12 squares long. If you wanted to create your center by joining all the fusible interfacings together into one large unit, you can do that. I would take your printed unit or already pieced fabric unit here, ironed fabric unit, and you can lay another unit of border fabric right side up or fusible side up. And we're going to just place the fused panel already on top of that, a little bit of seam allowance right there, and we can then carefully just take and iron those together to create one big piece. So you could very easily, if you wanted to lay the whole thing out first, you could easily take and join enough border grids to get you a 12 by 12 square grid panel. Today I'm just going to show you with the 1 3 by 12 piece here and using scrap fabrics. We're going to take your panel grid. You are going to place the 2.5-inch squares randomly in that grid. I would suggest that you grab your stack of fabrics, toss them in a bucket, in a bowl, in a bag, and then mix them up, and then reach in and pull one out. And as long as it's not one that's going to touch one that is identical, I would go with it. Use it. Don't overthink the center panel. We're going to, once these are attached, you're going to take your iron here. We're going to take our iron. We're going to very carefully just set it down on top of our squares and move it across the unit while we attach the fusible of the grid to the fusible squares. We're not ironing. You don't want to push back and forth because you don't want any of them to move on us. Okay. You want to be careful to avoid the exposed edges of the fusible. You can, if you wanted, lay down a pressing cloth or something. I don't normally have an issue with the small sections of fusible between my squares hurting my iron. That's completely up to you. Now, once these are adhered to your grid, we're going to start sewing. 1/4 inch seam, so I'm going to use my standard 1/4 inch foot. I'm going to fold right sides together down one long row. You can choose to do short rows if you want first, but I'm going to start with the long rows. We're folding right on the dotted line that's printed on the grid. And then we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew with 1/4 inch. Okay, so I already have my machine set up. with a 1/4 inch presser foot, neutral color thread. I'm not even going to pin. I'm just going to fold this right sides together. Let's get 1/4 inch here. And we're going to sew. That's what's nice about the grid. It's already planned out for me. I'm not dealing with a lot of small pieces. I'm not fussing too much with having to keep chain piecing pieces in. They're already adhered to the grid and not going anywhere. I'm going to come back with a pair of scissors and I'm going to cut at each intersection. I'm just going to snip right in between the two squares. This is just for the purposes of ironing in a little bit. This is going to allow us to press seam allowances in opposite directions and allow us to get perfect matching points. Now that that one is sewn, I'm going to take this one, I'm going to fold it right sides together, and we're going to sew that 1/4 inch. I can guarantee that this is faster than making the 16 9 patches that are required for the center of this table topper. And I'm going to clip those. I'm not cutting the seam, I'm just clipping up to it. Okay. Then we're going to come back over to the ironing board. Just so you can see, I just clipped to the seam and my first set of seams are finished. The reason that we clip those is so that we now can press these seams in opposite directions, so that when we go to fold this direction, we'll be able to nest our seams together to allow us to, one, reduce bulk, and to guarantee that we have a perfect point at that intersection. So I'm going to work my way through this strip set. Kind of giving it a press. It's okay if it doesn't want to stay that way. Ultimately, we're going to go and sew it the direction that we want. Now we're going to return to the machine. We're going to fold right sides together. and we're going to make sure that our seams go opposite directions, and we're going to sew 1/4 inch, and then we're going to fold this one and then continue down until this whole unit is sewn together. This is the perfect little place that if you do have a leader and ender project, or if you have your pumpkins prepped at this point, that every time you hit the end of a seam, you can feed in a fold and sew and flip triangle for your pumpkins. This is the perfect place for it. Since these are smaller, shorter seams, we can easily feed something in right now and continue sewing. There's a seam sewn. Seams are going in opposite directions. I'm going to kind of unfold that, flip the next one, make sure seams are nested, and sew it as well. Now that our unit is sewn, look at that, perfect intersecting points, and not one pin was used for this project. I'm going to pull out the ironing board, and we're going to give this a good iron to get everything to lay nice and flat. You can trim up the excess interfacing that is hanging out on the edge here, if you have any. If you're planning to join units together, I would do that 1 before you start piecing, or 2, piece all the individual rows and then sew them together with 1/4 inch seams. All right. Now I can use a little steam. There is 1 of 4 needed units for our center section. Now, like I said, you could join all of your grid panels together, creating a 12 square by 12 square center grid and then completing this step to all of it, or you can create 4 3 square by 12 square rows, create them, and then sew those rows together to create the 12 by 12 center panel. This panel should be a 24.5-inch square when it is completed. And then you will work forward or work through, if you've not already, completing the steps to creating all the individual pumpkins for your quilt, and then lay this out. The way that I would complete these grids here, or these 9 patches that you need for the corners, is take your grid panel and cut it down to 3 squares by 3 squares. So I could easily cut this. Let's do it this way. Leave that attached. And then cut. Here are the 3 by 3 grids. Lay out your 9 patch, sew it, and then you will have the perfect 9 patches for the 4 corners of your runner. Once your runner, all your pieces are assembled, use the quilt diagram on page 6 to lay them out, okay, and assemble them like they are shown. And when you are finished, the grid stays in the back. It actually is really nice because it seals up all those raw edges and strings that are happening or would happen with those all those 2.5-inch squares. And then you'll have your table topper there ready for you to use. So here he is. If we look at the quilting that they did in this topper, we have some straight line quilting done in the pumpkins. There is grid quilting completed in the center, and then there is stippling done in the background. So it's a pretty simple, basic quilt design. All except for the stippling can either be done with a walking foot on your machine, or if you are practicing ruler work, this is the perfect place for you to practice straight line ruler work and ruler work spacing for the particular quilt top. Now, as a reminder, if you do want to try the grid for this project, you want to purchase 2 panels of the Easy Piecing Border Grid 2-inch. Okay, so you can use 2 panels of that to create everything that you need for your center and for your corner 4 patches. I hope everybody enjoyed this project for today. I think these pumpkins are absolutely adorable around the outside, and there's nothing better than a little postage stamp center. If you have any questions, please reach out and I'll be happy to help and assist you with this project. And we hope that everybody has a great day.